A 65-year-old black grandmother collapses on a sidewalk during an asthma attack. But instead of helping her, the police tase her, then lie about everything what they didn't expect was that her granddaughter would turn their cover-up into a national reckoning. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's about the moment one family turned a tragedy into a revolution. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless, dear viewer. What you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are, watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. Under the wide, humid skies of Savannah, Georgia, the morning moved with the slow grace of the south. Birds chirped lazily between Spanish moss-draped oaks, and the sidewalk shimmered faintly in the heat. Loretta James, 65 years old, and dressed in her Sunday best though it was only Thursday, walked carefully down the cracked pavement, one hand clutching her purse, the other her inhaler, just in case. She had always carried herself with elegance, the kind you don't find in money, but in memory, a struggle, love, of pride, a widow of a Vietnam vet, retired nurse who had delivered babies and held hands in their final hours. Loretta was known in the neighborhood as Miss Loretta, never ma'am, never honey, just. Loretta spoken with reverence. That morning she had walked 3 blocks to the pharmacy to pick up her asthma medication. She'd meant to go the day before, but the heat had flared up her joints, and she needed to rest. Her breathing was already tight when she stepped off the curb at the corner of East 39th and Aberorn. She could feel the familiar constriction behind her ribs, that creeping panic that comes when the lungs no longer obey. She reached the shaded bus stop and sat down on the metal bench, her hands shaking slightly. She fumbled in her bag. The small plastic inhaler had slipped between her folded receipts and loose coins. She bent over to find it, her wheezing now sharp and audible. A young man passing by noticed her distress and hesitated, reaching for his phone. But before he could approach, the sharp screech of tires split the air. A patrol car swung abruptly into the curb with force disproportionate to the scene. Dust rose, the driver's door slammed open, and out stepped a tall, square-jawed white officer. His uniform was crisp, his mirrored sunglasses catching the sunlight as he strode forward like he owned the street. Officer Blake Rennick, 33 years old, recently transferred from a department in Alabama, had a reputation even locals only whispered about. No nonsense, no patience, and though never officially recorded, no hesitation when it came to policing black bodies. From behind his sunglasses, he saw a hunched, elderly black woman fumbling in her bag, bent low, breathing erratically. But Blake didn't see distress. He didn't see the terror in her eyes. He didn't see the inhaler falling from her grasp onto the sidewalk. He saw a threat. Ma'am, hands where I can see them, he barked, his voice echoing off the brick walls. The young man, watching from the sidewalk, froze. Loretta looked up, confused, gasping, her hands trembling midair. Please, she tried to say, but it came out as a rasp. Her lungs were locking up. The inhaler was just inches away, but she couldn't reach. I said, hands up. Now Blake's hand hovered over his holstered weapon. His stance widened. She lifted her hands higher, shaking uncontrollably. I can't breathe. She wheezed to the ground. You're resisting. He snapped. Then, before anyone could process what was happening, he pulled out his taser. A crackle of electricity, a scream, and Loretta's frail body crumpled to the ground. Her purse spilled open, pills scattered. Her ID lay clearly visible beside the inhaler. He hadn't bothered to see the bystander screamed. One woman dropped her coffee and ran forward. She's sick, that's my neighbor. Another man shouted. She's having an asthma attack, you idiot. But Blake stepped forward, one hand on his belt, the other holding the taser. Like it was righteous, I gave a lawful order. He said, breath short, eyes cold. She didn't comply. She couldn't. Someone yelled. Loretta was on her side now, curled in on herself, lips turning pale. Her chest heaved with no air, only dry, gasping spasms. The inhaler had rolled 2 feet away. Blake didn't reach for it. He didn't call for medical aid. He radioed dispatch. Possible intoxication, suspect unresponsive need. Backup, he never said the word asthma, never said medical emergency, because, too, him Loretta James wasn't a grandmother on the verge of collapse. She wasn't a woman gasping her. Final breaths, she was a suspect, a profile of danger A. Stereotype a few seconds later, a silver sedan screeched to a halt across the street. A young woman burst from the driver's side, Loretta's daughter Denise. Late 30s with her hair still wrapped in a work scarf she had been on her way to. Pick her up after a missed call, she screamed when she saw her mother on the ground. Mama, she shouted, running toward the scene. Step back, ma'am, Blake ordered, stepping in her path. Scene is under control. Under control? She shrieked. She's dying. That's my mother. Denise dropped to her knees beside Loretta, her hands fluttered helplessly over her mother's body. She needs her inhaler. My God, what did you do? Someone had finally called 911 Hawan for medical, but it was too late. Loretta's eyes were wide open. Glazed, her chest had stopped moving. The inhaler was still lying under the bench. No one had picked it up when the paramedics arrived 5 minutes later. The crowd had swelled, phones were out, voices were rising, but Loretta James lay still. A woman who survived segregation, marched in the 70s, raised 3 children on a nurse's salary, and who died alone and afraid on a sidewalk in broad daylight. Because one man saw her as a danger before he saw her as a human. They covered her body as Denise sobbed beside her. Officer Blake stood back unmoved, arms crossed while the cameras rolled. He didn't know it yet, but his life and this city were about to change forever. The press release came just hours after Loretta James died on that blistering Savannah sidewalk. Typed in sterile language, it portrayed a narrative that would have gone unquestioned in another decade or even another year. Subject was acting erratically. Officer feared for his safety. Commands were ignored. Non-lethal force deployed in accordance with department guidelines. There was no mention of her name, no mention of the inhaler, no mention of the crowd that screamed for mercy. Just one phrase that cut through like a blade. No signs of police misconduct. Officer Blake Rennick returned home that night to silence. He sat at his kitchen table, the bright overhead light casting harsh shadows across his face. On the table in front of him was a copy of his own statement. He read it again, the lies settling like ash in his throat. He hadn't mentioned that she was elderly. He hadn't written the word asthma. And most damning of all, he hadn't mentioned the crowd. Not one voice, not one bystander with a phone, as far as his version of the truth. When he had been alone, and he had been right, but he wasn't alone. On the opposite side of the city, in a small apartment filled with soft jazz and flickering candles, Jasmine DuPont sat on her couch replaying the footage she had captured on her phone. She hadn't meant to film that day. She was just walking her dog when she saw the patrol car barrel into the curb. Like it was chasing a fugitive, instinct made her reach for her phone, and by the time she pressed record, she had already started crying. The video was shaky, the audio raw, but it caught everything. The shouted commands, Loretta's labored voice, the sharp snap of the taser, the way her body crumpled. With a sickening finality, an Officer Rennick standing over her like a soldier. In enemy territory, Jasmine didn't sleep that night. She watched the video again and again, each time feeling like she was witnessing something sacred being violated. When she finally uploaded it anonymously to social media, she did so with trembling fingers. Her caption was simple: "This is what happened to Loretta James. Don't let them lie about the video." Spread like wildfire by dawn, the clip had been viewed over 300,000 times by noon. It was on national news. Hashtags formed like storm clouds. Justice for Loretta, say her name, Rustis. She couldn't breathe. The footage tore through the carefully constructed lie of the press release like paper in a hurricane, and with every share, every retweet, the city's silence began to crack. At Savannah PD headquarters, the tone shifted from dismissive to defensive. Officials scrambled to issue a new statement, this time acknowledging newly surfaced video footage currently under review. Internal Affairs launched a preliminary inquiry, but the language remained bloodless, measured, intended to soothe, not to solve. What they didn't anticipate was the fury outside City Hall. A vigil was forming. Hundreds gather, holding Candles and signs bearing Loretta's name, and faced Denise James, her daughter, stood at the front of. The crowd with a portrait of her mother clutched to her chest. She hadn't spoken publicly, yet not. To the media, not even to police, but that night she stepped forward, her voice trembling at first, then rising like a wave. My mama walked to the store to get her medicine, she said, eyes scanning the sea of strangers who suddenly felt like family. She couldn't breathe, and instead of helping her, they killed her. The crowd answered with a cry that rose into the warm night air. People chanted not in anger alone, but in mourning and remembrance. Each voice carried the weight of shared pain because everyone in that crowd knew Loretta wasn't the first. She wasn't even the only one that week, but now they had a lens away to see the lie. Back in his home, Blake Rennick watched the footage on his own phone, not the department's copy, not a news recap, the real video, the one with shaky hands. And truth too loud to ignore, he saw himself on that screen not as a hero, not as a protector, but as a man who had killed a woman in front of witnesses and told the world it was procedure. And for the first time in his career, he felt something fracture. He didn't speak to his union rep that night. He didn't draft a revised statement. He sat in his dark kitchen, the video on a loop, the sound of Loretta's final gasps echoing through the room like a ghost that had found its voice because now the lie had a lens and the world was watching. Of all the places Loretta James had lived in her 65 years, the small clapper house on Given Street held the most weight. It wasn't because of its peeling paint or the crooked porch swing that swayed with every breeze. It was because of what it survived, what she survived within it. After the footage of her death went viral, the world met Loretta in those final brutal seconds, but no one really knew her, not the officer who ended her life, not the press who dissected her last breath. But the past has a way of clawing its way to the surface, especially when truth demands reckoning. Denise James returned to that house 3 days after the vigil, not because she wanted to, but because something in her mother's voice still lingered in the silence of its rooms. The neighborhood was different now. Police cruisers circled slower. Neighbors who used to wave now paused with solemn nods. It was as if the house had become a shrine. Though no one had placed flowers on the porch, Denise walked past the living room, where her mother once danced Al Green on Sunday mornings, past the kitchen, where Loretta brewed Cory coffee, so strong it could jolt your soul. Every corner was haunted, not with ghosts, but with moments. In the back bedroom, tucked into an old cedar chest, Denise found what she hadn't known she needed: journals, letters, newspaper, clippings of life documented with quiet determination. Her mother's handwriting, looped firm, patient, unfolded like a second voice. Denise sat on the edge of the bed and began to read, and slowly the woman she'd lost returned to her in full color. Loretta had grown up in the same neighborhood just 4 blocks away. She was 12 the first time she was called a slur by a white officer, 15 when she was shoved against a patrol car for walking home from school. Too slow at 19, she joined the local chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, quietly organizing sit-ins and voter registration drives. Her name never made the headlines, but her fingerprints were on the foundation of every right. They had to fight for decades. Later, one letter stood out, addressed to a man named Samuel Carter. It was dated 1978. Sam, it read, "They think we're done because the marches are quieter now, because the dogs aren't biting, but this hatred has only changed its uniform. I see it in the way the new officer stares at me when I cash a check. I feel it when my brother's car is stopped 5 times in one summer. The fight is quieter, but it's not over, not." Even close, Denise had never heard of Samuel Carter. A quick search revealed a photo. An aging activist turned historian living in Atlanta. She called. He answered on the first ring. "I was waiting for this call," he said, as if time had bent toward this moment. Loretta was the one who kept us all grounded. When the cameras left, she stayed. When the noise faded, she listened. She reminded us that justice isn't a wave, it's a tide, slow, relentless. Carter came to Savannah the next morning, carrying a battered leather satchel filled with copies of old FBI files, redacted documents, and photos from meetings taken in basement, where young black leaders plotted strategy under threat of death. Loretta was in many of them, standing in the back, taking notes. Always there, she knew the system. Carter said as they sat in the same kitchenware. Loretta once hummed while washing dishes, not just the laws of patterns. The cover-up she told me back in 2002 that the Savannah Police Department had. A file on her, that even as an old woman, she wasn't invisible to them, she was a reminder, and reminders are dangerous, those words settled into. Denise, like cold iron, a lie the officer told the speed of the department's initial cover-up, the ease with which her mother was erased. It wasn't just about a bad decision made in a moment. It was about a city that had spent generations burying the truth, hoping no one would dig it back up. But now the past was loud again local. Journalists digging deeper uncovered something more. Officer Blake Rennick wasn't just a new recruit with poor judgment his transfer to Savannah had. Come under pressure at his last post in Mon, 3 complaints of excessive force had mysteriously disappeared from his record. One involved an elderly black man with dementia slammed to the ground during a wellness check. No charges were ever filed. The footage had gone missing. The department chalked it up to a clerical error. It was a pattern, one that stretched across precincts, counties, years officers shuffled between. Departments like bad debts. No one wanted to admit Rennick's record was polished, but only because the filth had been swept beneath different rugs. Now the rugs were on fire. Federal investigators arrived in Savannah a week after Loretta's death. Nathaniel Chambers, the same deputy attorney general who had quietly helped dismantle corrupt departments in Ferguson and Louisville, led the team in a press conference outside the precinct's gates. He didn't mince words. This is not an isolated incident. This is the result of a culture that values silence over justice. That night, Denise returned to her mother's house and sat on the front porch. She lit a candle, not for ceremony, not for protest, but for memory, for the woman whose light had been quietly burning long before anyone cared to see it. Neighbors came, some brought flowers. Others brought stories. A man in his 60s described how Loretta had helped him get his first bank loan when no one else would vouch for him. A young woman said she once watched Loretta stop a fight between 2 teens, not by yelling, but by asking them what their grandmothers would think. Loretta James hadn't just been a victim, she'd been a keeper of history, a protector of dignity. And now that past, the one they tried to bury, was rising like smoke from a long suppressed fire, and the city of Savannah would never be the same. When Ayanna James stepped onto the steps of the Savannah courthouse, the air was thick with history cameras, flash microphones angled toward her like arrows drawn taut, ready to pierce. But she didn't flinch, she didn't stumble, she stood tall, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had no place in the voice her grandmother had, passed down through blood, through story, through quiet example. Ayanna had been raised by Loretta in that old house on Given Street. She remembered sitting cross-legged on the living room floor while her grandmother combed her hair and recited Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, and Baldwin, not for show, not for school, but as scripture. Loretta had always said, words are how we survive. Silence is how they erase us. So when they tried to erase her grandmother, Ayanna remembered every word. In the days following the revelations about Officer Rennick's past, the city buzzed with outrage, but outrage was nothing new to Ayanna. What she wanted, what she demanded, was accountability. She launched the Justice for Loretta campaign with a late-night post that read, "They thought they could silence my grandmother with a bullet. They didn't realize they just handed her story a megaphone." Within hours, it had been shared over 200,000 times. Ayanna wasn't a politician. She wasn't even an activist. By trade, she was a second-year law student at Spelman Home for the summer, interning with a local nonprofit. But when she saw the police department's official statement, the cold, sanitized paragraph that spoke of regret and procedure, something snapped inside her. Regret doesn't look like a loaded gun. Procedure doesn't look like blood on the sidewalk. She began holding town hall meetings, not in auditoriums, but in church basement and school gymnasiums. She listened before she spoke to single mothers who feared sending their sons to the corner store, to veterans like Mr. Hawkins who'd served 2 tours but couldn't get the cops to treat him like a human being on his own, street to high school students who had already learned how to keep their hands visible during a traffic stop. Ayanna became their voice, not because she wanted to lead, but because someone had to, and the legacy of her grandmother gave her no other choice. When the city council announced that a review board would be formed to examine patterns of misconduct, Ayanna was the first to demand that it include real community members, not just politicians. And lawyers, you can't fix what you won't see, she said during a press conference. And you can't see anything from a closed door. She didn't stop there, she pushed for legislation and ordinance that would require all police disciplinary records to be publicly accessible, that would ban officers with multiple use of force, complaints from being rehired in neighboring departments, she called it. The Loretta Axum mocked called it idealistic, too ambitious, but every time they told her to slow down, she remembered her grandmother's calloused hands folding protest leaflets. In the kitchen, change never came from waiting politely. The resistance came. Hard death threats, harassment, anonymous calls to her school questioning her. Character the worst came on a Thursday. A photo slipped under her windshield. Her grandmother's lifeless body, grainy, printed in black and white, with a single line scrolled across the bottom. She didn't listen either. Ayanna didn't speak for 2 days after that, not publicly, not even to her friends. She stayed inside her grandmother's room, wrapped in the scent of old book, shea butter, and faint perfume. She read the letters Loretta had written during the civil rights movement, the ones no one had seen but her. In one, Loretta wrote, "If they come for me, they'll be met with generation, louder than mine ever dared to be." Ayanna emerged that Sunday at the largest protest Savannah had seen in decades. Thousands lined the streets. Black, brown, white, old, and young Ayanna climbed a makeshift stage, no speech in hand, no notes, just a voice steady with purpose. They killed my grandmother, thinking she was just an old woman on a morning walk. But she was a library, she was the ledger, she was a witness. And I am the echo, I am the consequence, and we are the verdict they never saw coming. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. For the first time, it felt like the city was truly awake. Loretta James was no longer just a name in a headline. She was a spark, and Ayanna was the wildfire, and nothing was going to stop it now. The courtroom was silent in a way that made sound itself feel heavy. Each scrape of a chair, each shift in breath, echoed against the marble walls like thunder. At the center of it all sat Ayanna James, eyes steady, her grandmother's scarf wrapped tightly around her wrist. It wasn't just fabric, it was armor, and she needed it because this wasn't just about proving guilt. This was about forcing a country to look at itself. The state of Georgia versus Officer Travis Rennick began 5 months after the morning Loretta James was killed. The defense tried to delay. They claimed procedural inconsistencies, media bias, even emotional interference from the protests that had surged through the city. But the pressure was too high, the scrutiny too intense. The trial would proceed, and the world was watching. In the first few days, the prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. They played the footage captured by a nearby porch camera, Loretta walking slowly down West View Avenue, then Officer Rennick pulling up behind her, the confrontation, the shouting, the single fatal shot they brought in. Experts, use of force, analysts, civil rights historians, medical examiners, they presented Rennick's record, dozens of complaints, a history of misconduct, buried warnings from former precincts, and then they brought in the community, people who had never spoken publicly before stepped forward. Now an elderly man who had been pulled over by Rennick 3 times in 2 weeks for driving too slow, a teenage boy who'd been slammed against a squad car for having a hoodie up in the rain, a mother whose daughter still refused to walk past the street where Loretta died. Their voices were not polished, they trembled, they cracked, but they filled the courtroom with a kind of truth that no legal tactic could erase. The defense countered with everything it had. They painted Rennick as a man under pressure, claimed he'd feared for his life, that Loretta had appeared to be reaching into her purse. They leaned into every tired stereotype, implied threat, and legal loophole the system allowed, but this time, unlike so many before it, didn't land the same, not with the jury, not with the public, not with the country, and not with Ayanna. She was called to stand on day 9. Her voice didn't shake. She spoke of Loretta's life not as a symbol, but as a person. Her walks, her activism, her belief that dignity wasn't something you earned, it was something you never had to justify. She described the phone, called the body, the emptiness, the months that followed, and she ended with something that silenced Even the defense, my grandmother survived Jim Crow. She survived the segregation riots. She outlived 2 husbands and 3 cancers, and you're asking me to believe a 65-year-old woman with arthritis and a paper bag was a threat to a trained police officer with a loaded gun. Know what she was a threat to was a lie we've been telling ourselves that we've moved past this, that we're better now. There was no applause, no outburst, just breath held tight by everyone in the room when closing arguments ended and the jury was dismissed. To deliberate, Savannah seemed to exhale. All at once outside, protesters had gathered. Again, quiet candle lit, many of them sitting cross-legged on the courthouse lawn. Some had signs with Loretta's name, others just held photos of their own. Family members lost to similar stories. The verdict came the next morning, 11 hours of deliberation. The courtroom was packed. Ayanna held her breath. So did the judge. So did the nation. On the charge of manslaughter in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. No one shouted no. One screamed. What happened was quieter, more profound. Ayanna broke, not with a sob, but with a long, silent exhale, as if her lungs had been locked for months. She closed her eyes. In that moment, she saw her grandmother, not bleeding on the sidewalk, but seated at her kitchen table, laughing. Ho remembered the sentencing would come later, but this was the moment a police officer had been held accountable. In a southern courtroom for the killing of an unarmed black woman, it wasn't justice because Loretta was still gone, but it was accountability, and that mattered. In the weeks that followed, things began to shift. Savannah's mayor signed the Loretta Act into city law. State legislators picked it up. Next, police review boards were given actual teeth. Subpoena power, budget oversight, civilian leadership. Training policies were rewritten. Officers like Rennick could no longer be quietly transferred to new departments without record. And in the center of the city, just a few blocks from where Loretta had taken her last walk, the park she'd frequented every Sunday morning was renamed in her honor, not just for what had happened, but for what had changed because of it. Ayanna visited the park, often not for speeches, not for photos, but to sit, to remember, to breathe. One morning, a little girl approached her, maybe 8 or 9, holding her mother's hand. She looked up shyly and asked, "Are you the lady who made the police tell the truth?" Ayanna crouched down, smiled. "No, baby, I'm the lady who wouldn't stop asking questions." And as the sun rose over Loretta James Park, Savannah felt like a city where asking questions finally mattered, where silence was no longer the safest option, and where one grandmother's walk had turned into a march that could not be stopped in the quiet of early morning. Loretta James set out on what should have been a simple walk, a ritual carved into her days. For decades, she wasn't famous, she wasn't powerful. She was a 65-year-old grandmother who carried her strength not on her sleeve, but in the way she moved through a world that never gave her the grace it owed. That morning, she wore soft shoes and carried a bag of groceries, and by nightfall, she became a name on headlines. Another life extinguished by the callousness of power wrapped in a badge. But Loretta wasn't just a victim. She became a spark. Her murder, cold and senseless, peeled back the veil that many tried to keep over their eyes. It exposed the rot beneath the surface, a system that had learned to hide its cruelty behind paperwork, body cam malfunctions, and fear for safety excuses. Officer Travis Rennick wasn't the first to misuse his badge, but because of Loretta, he was one of the few forced to face justice, and justice in this case did not come quietly. Ayanna James, Loretta's granddaughter, took up the fight her grandmother never asked her to. Bare grief turned to resolve. Silence became protest, and with the eyes of the city and eventually the country on her, she forced a long-ignored truth into the center of the room, that racism and policing is not just a relic of the past. It is alive, it is systemic, and it is deadly. What followed wasn't easy, it wasn't cinematic. There were tears, setbacks, threats, but there was also resilience, louder and more contagious than hate. A trial that didn't get buried, a verdict that stunned the nation. A park renamed, a city moved to rethink what safety actually means. Most of all, a community that realized this wasn't just about Loretta. It was about every black woman told to move along, every black man asked to prove he belonged, every family that's been told to calm down while burying their own. Loretta's story became more than a tragedy, it became a turning point, and still the most powerful part of this Story might be its quiet ending, not the courtroom cheers or news cycles, but the image of Ayanna sitting on a bench in the park, now bearing her grandmother's name. Not protesting, not speaking, just being, because that too is a form of resistance. To exist fully, openly, and without apology in a world that tried to erase. Yuso, what can we learn from Loretta's story? We learn that justice isn't something we wait for, it's something we demand, one voice at a time. We learn that silence doesn't protect us, but speaking out might protect. Someone else, we learn that grief can build movements and that love for family, for dignity, for truth, can shake the foundations of entire systems most. Importantly, we learn that change is not just possible, it is inevitable when ordinary people refuse to look away. If you ever feel like your voice is too small to matter, remember Loretta. She didn't lead a march, she didn't hold a sign, she just walked with her head high and her story in her bones. And when injustice struck, the world couldn't ignore her. So let her memory be your reminder. Sit when they tell you to leave, speak when they tell you to be quiet. Ask questions, demand better. And when the moment comes to rise, don't hesitate. Thank you for being part of this story. If it moved you, if it opened your eyes or reminded you of what truly matters, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter, stories that challenge, stories that heal, and stories that make sure voices like Loretta's are never forgotten. We're just getting started.